We're going to begin. It is right on the hour. And so let the workshop begin. I'm just going to make sure that I'm saying everything that needs to be said. First of all, I just want to say great big welcome. And if you intended to come to the workshop that was about sermon writing and it's dovetailing with biblical telling, you are in the right place. And if you didn't, you're going to love it, or you're going to leave and find the one you wanted. My name is Linnea Good, and so I'm the tech host, and so it's just my job to make sure that the workshop flows smoothly. And so drop me a note in the chat if you have a tech question or a problem as we go along, but you won't, because Larry is going to engage us the whole way through.
No,
This workshop is 50 minutes long. And I'm going to give Larry 5-minute warning before the last 5 minutes, because the last 5 minutes we're going to ask you to, we're going to tell you what's coming up next after the workshop, and we're also going to ask you for your little mini pop-up evaluation, and just to get it quickly get your impression of how things went in this workshop, which is just really so helpful for us. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend, Reverend Dr. Larry Brown. He's been in professional ministry since 1966. He is a retired professor of human geography, and that I'd like him to talk about all day long, but you can ask him yourself later. And more recently has served as instructor for the University of Missouri. I say Missouri, he doesn't. Extension Lifelong Learning Program.
Missouri.
I know. He has been a part-time storyteller for nearly 40 years, a member of the Network of Biblical Storytellers International, the NBSI. He's an epic teller and workshop leader. And he joined us on the missions to India in 2018 and 2020, and has been on a variety of really interesting, enriching missions and educational trips to 10 different countries. Most important of all, however, he has been second and third place winner in statewide liars contests. So I know you're going to be so glad to take part in this workshop with Larry Brown.
Yeah, that's been the difficulty. I have to know, is this a lie? Is this a sermon of truth? Or is this teaching, accuracy? So I have to sometimes say, the following is true. But then, of course, in biblical fashion, the appropriate question would be, what is truth? Well, what we're doing today, truly, is to explore the use of the narrative plot line of a biblical text to guide how we would structure and develop a sermon. Now, I have to say first that I am committed to oral narrative. I do have this belief that oral narrative does something perhaps in a more holistic fashion to us than just reading something or viewing something like a movie that's constructed. I have noticed that particularly when I have told stories to children who have never really experienced a personal narrative. You can tell when, oh, the image happened in their head. They weren't given the image when the light comes on. Now, for me, oral narrative does that. It evokes in us our own experiences. So we're not being provided the image, but we are invited to step into the image that is directly connected to our experience. And that's what oral narrative does for me. I have been working quite a bit in the last 2 to 3 years with the Gospel of Mark. And I come out of that understanding that Mark was essentially an oral narrative that later on begins to be put into writing, which much of the biblical text functions that way. But I think that we can look at the oral pathways of a biblical narrative to say, that would be a good pathway for the oral presentation of interpretations of the word that we do in the act of preaching. Now, I do have a little disagreement that I heard earlier in the keynote about sermon creation. I sort of referred to what was said as, well, that was old school. When I first arrived at graduate seminary, sermon construction was propositional. You had to have a thesis and then support it, with proofs to your thesis. Or, as sometimes said, you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. But I'm coming at it more from maybe an inductive perspective, where I want folks to discover. I want, in the midst of the sermon, as really good stories are, for you to go, oh, I get it. So that personal connection is what's happening. So let me share first a story, and I'm going to use it as a case study for our work this afternoon. And this comes from Mark in the 4th chapter. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. And leaving the crowd behind, they let him into the boat, where he was already, and other boats were with them. But a great storm arose on the lake, and water was beating against the side of the boat, such that the boat was becoming swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And the disciples woke him up saying, Teacher, don't you care? We're all gonna die. And Jesus woke up. He rebuked the wind. He spoke to the sea and said, Silence, be still. And the wind stopped, and it was dead calm. And he asked of his disciples, Why were you afraid? What happened to your faithfulness? And they were in awe and began to talk to each other, saying, Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, I want us to use this story as a kind of model, and we're going to kind of work with the narrative plot line, and we'll talk again about how that might inform us about the structure of a sermon. Now, any good preparation for a sermon, as you know, as any good preparation for the telling of a biblical narrative, you have to get the context. And for us, looking at this story, there's a number of things that I would call the external context. Or if I would use the language of human geography, what's going on there in the rest of society in that time in which this story would have taken place? So for us, our location is in Galilee. What do you know about Galilee? So those of you that have studied biblical material, it's up north. It is, yes, it's in the center of a lot of other cultures, but it's relatively removed from the center of things in Jerusalem, correct? Galilee is
You're
in,
asking people to answer
yeah,
what
yeah, you can respond to that.
time in, folks.
Yeah,
It's a hotbed of rebelliousness.
exactly. And that rebellion in Galilee went all the way back to earlier periods of Israel's history. So people understood. And Galileans were, as we would talk in Missouri language, they were like from the Ozarks. They had a different dialect. They were country people. But yes, that rebellion. So we're talking Galilee. And as you know, in that time period, who was running things economically and politically? Well, Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod, and pretty much, as you know, the Roman Empire's economic and political system. So what was happening to fisher folk and to small-time agriculturists in that period? What was going on with them?
They had to pay a big tax.
Exactly. It taxed in a number of levels. They were, producing, and in fact, some cases, Herod Antipas had them overproducing, as he would get the corner on the market in wheat, and then you got the corner in the market in dried fish in Galilee. So they were pressed, pushed, taxed, and shoved. This was a very desperate situation. So we're dealing now with working class, fisher folk and agriculturalists. Jesus is a part of that. That's a part of the setting. But we're looking now at a fishing situation, fishing village on the shore of Galilee. Imagine what the sights and sounds and smells of that setting would be. Some of you are familiar with what it smells like when you're down there at the docks or when you're out in a fishing boat. So there's going to be that water and earthiness situation for them.
Are you asking for us for that from
Well,
us
yeah,
right now?
anytime you all want to respond and say, "Oh, it's like this," then sure enough, jump
We're
in.
just aware that this is the later in the day of the conference. So I figure folks just throw it in there and don't worry that you have to get the right answer. Just throw an answer
There's
into Larry's
in
questions.
many cases, no right answer, but it's just begging you to say, remember that context. Now, that's the context in which the story is happening, but the context in which the story is being told and heard is a little bit larger context and probably later in history. So in Mark, we're looking back and probably the first generation of Christians who are struggling with what did Jesus do that is meaningful to us now that we're dealing with diaspora out of Jerusalem. We're dealing with the oppression that is coming more and more from the Roman Empire. So the questions of what does it mean to follow Jesus is rooted in the origins of that story and also manifest in the complications of that story later in history for the next couple of generations. For them, there was both an urgency of that time and an urgency of later in the time. So you put that story in context, there are really questions about what is Jesus doing? What is the meaning of messiahship, perhaps, for Jesus? Or what realm of God are we talking about? Which kingdom, which empire are we talking about? And it gets back to the dignity and worth and wholeness of people. Now, what I want us to do is to just remind ourselves when we're studying biblical passages, preparing to preach, that kind of context needs to be in our heads. It might be shared in the sermon as it's helpful to define some things, to get some meaning, but that's really for us to begin to help our internalizing of getting that story inside ourselves. But there's another context, and that's in the Gospel of Mark itself. So what happened before and after that story? Well, we look back at the Gospel of Mark, and we start seeing again some of the things that were happening. But I want to point to you the very first phrase of that passage. On that day. And I tried in the telling to emphasize, oh, that day. So we need to look back and see what did happen on that day. Now, you know, Mark, there's a lot that happens in a short amount of time with a great deal of urgency. Well, help me out. Do you remember some of the things that may have happened on that day? So he's with the disciples. A multitude of people have shown up here on the shore of Lake Galilee. He's appointed a dozen of his followers to be apostles. He went home and was overwhelmed by a crowd that needed healing and wouldn't even let him have lunch. His family, some of the crowd, accused him of being crazy and or possessed. Jesus taught the crowd on the shore from a boat and told some of his several most famous parables, the Sowing Seeds trilogy. It was a long day. It was exhausting. So when you think about on that day, now you're pulling yourself into it as you understand the situation for Jesus. So right away, in the way the story flows, there's like new world. What's going on here on that day? Now, as we look again, as that story happens, the plot unfolds. And the story develops, and we know now that this is really part of the beginning and toward the ending of the Galilee ministry. We've got all sorts of healings and questions and controversies as he will move closer and closer to Jerusalem. So it's a kind of a pivotal moment in the ministry in Galilee. And hence then we get the next sort of phrases that start saying, well, wait a minute, what's the rest of the story here? When a couple of key phrases and words come out that reveal something, when he said to the disciples, let's go across to the other side. Now, what would have the other side have been in that time? You can respond to that. What would have been the other side of Sea or Lake Galilee?
Okay, and you're going to give a little time for more than one person to answer, right?
More than one person. What
All
was
right, off you go, folks.
what was the other side? Yeah, Michael.
It would have been a Gentile territory. It would have
That's
been
right. Not Galilee, Gentile territory. Yes.
Is it the Decapolis over there?
Yes, eventually you get over into the Decapolis, the Greek cities. So you're looking at Greco-Roman culture. So it's not even Galilee. It's not Hebrew. Yes, for the most part. Yeah. The other side. Now, given Galilee is home territory, this might have some implications about future territory. So we're getting some interesting things. We're getting some contracts that crossing to the other side has got some powerful, more symbolic meanings. But now, what was that day like? Tell me again, what was that day like? There might be another suggestion to going to the other side for another purpose, right? What's the
well,
next?
it was a busy day.
It
was
sure
a
was.
busy day.
And what's the next phrase? And leaving the crowd behind. So the other side might also have some suggestions as can we get a break here? Can we move to another setting and have some relief? So whether that crossing has to do with suggestions of new territory or strangeness or foreign dimensions, or it means getting away from something over here, the crossing winds up becoming very important. So there's a clue here that the plot is taking us somewhere. And that's what I want to look at, this narrative plot line. So as we heard that story, you know that story, tell me what the narrative arc is. What now are the aspects that take this story somewhere? That day, crossing, what happens next?
Are you
Jesus
asking us
calls us.
what the
Yeah,
events
yeah.
are? What the pieces of the story are?
Yeah, pieces of the story, yeah.
Jesus falls asleep.
Yeah, well, yes, but what happened, what was going on before we hear that he was asleep?
It was a storm.
Storm coming.
The storm hits, yeah. Then Jesus is asleep, and then who wakes him up?
The disciples.
Disciples.
afraid.
And what's their condition?
They're afraid.
They're afraid. They're afraid. And Jesus' response, there's two sort of particular kinds of response that start coming at the end. His first response is to the storm, right?
Mhm.
And his
Calms the storm.
second is his relationship with the disciples. And what's the issue here?
Why?
Why are you? Why
Don't you have faith?
Yeah, and the word there is probably, the Greek there probably is more suggestive of relationship rather than assent to belief. So it probably, that's why I chose to use the word faithfulness. Some might even say the better word is trust, but it has to do with relationship and process there. And then their response is sort of the end of the story, in which they're, whoa, who is this dude? Now, what we want to do is to.
Sorry, Larry, there's some words in there that I find quite startling. Rather than saying, Jesus, we're in danger, can you do something to help us? Their
Yes.
words are, don't you
Don't
care?
you care? That's right. And you're already sort of heading into where we want to go to the depth of meaning, but that's an excellent point. And when we start coming back, I first wanted to sort of make sure we know the arc of that story. Then we'll come back now and start looking at some of those meanings that are tucked in there. But that's a particular one. So they call him rabbi teacher. And what's the matter? Don't you care? When the relationship with the rabbi is supposed to be one of, aren't you taking care of us? Well, so that's one of those in-depth moments after we start looking at the arc. Well, I have one other question before we start going plumbing down into some of the meanings of these terms is, so who's the witness to this story? Where's this story coming from? There's not some scribe out there, taking notes. This is a very personal, intimate story, is it not? The story is being remembered from the folks who would have experienced that. There was not now. Remember, where was the crowd? They're over there. Haven't got to the other side. So
Although there were boats coming after.
there were
and-
other boats alongside, which should have known the storm. They might have. So
And that was new to me in the story. I didn't recall them at all.
Yeah. Well, maybe a little bit of context here. Now, typically, Sea of Galilee, fishing would have primarily been done at night. That was the majority of fishing was done. Haul in the fish by daytime, then the women and the children start spreading out the fish to dry in the sun the next day. So you generally head out to fish, and you would have gone out with several boats. These were not large boats. These were boats that would only have held a half a dozen folks typically, and you're casting nets and so on. So it was a community project to go out there. But typically it would have been men. And typically able-bodied who could handle that kind of situation, which suggests to us another level of that story is, wouldn't they have experienced the Sea of Galilee before? Now, meteorologically, we know some things happen on the Sea of Galilee. There are storms, fronts that move in, and there's depressions that occur, and storms can erupt relatively quickly. But they would have known that was not an unusual phenomena for storms to come and go with a good deal of regular experience. But what we're looking at now is the trajectory of this story. I want to sort of suggest we are creating more and more complexity. The simple phrase, well, on that day, you got in a boat, went to the side. Well, no. There's more and more complexity. So in the arc of the story, we begin with setting the stage, which is dangling a number of questions and concerns, and it gets more complex as you go. More and more levels of ambiguity. And even at the very end, the questions and comments that are there still have left us with some ambiguity. So this is like contrary to a lot of other stories in which I know what's going to happen. But this is one of those stories that you don't know what's going to happen or why until you become, should I use the term, immersed in the story, until the water is overwhelming. So we want to think about creating this story that connects to our experience of crossings, of complexities, and finding resolution somehow at the end. One way of talking about it is the problem gets more intense, and then there is some sense of calm, but then you're sent off in a slightly new direction at the end. And that's
Would you you can tell me if I'm ahead of you.
okay.
Are you describing the way you might craft a sermon about this story, like that you're taking us back to the beginning and walking us through and making more complex every part of the story as you go along?
Yes, and that's how we will craft that. My suggestion is, so that's how the sermon on this story ought to be crafted. it gets more complex the further you get into the sermon. Now, in a sermonic, we need to begin to make connections personally to these things too. I mean, at least in my sermon preparation, I don't want to preach on something that is just totally, abstract and philosophical. I want a place where either I can have some assurance that the folk that I'm dealing with are going to say, oh yeah, I've been there. I've been there. So we start thinking about our connections. When are the times that we had to go someplace else, or when we left some kind of security? When were those places when we caught in storms, either culturally, politically, economically, or spiritually, personally get caught in a storm? Where were the times of relief and calm? So we want to be looking for those connections to those various parts of the arc of that story, so that at the right time in the sermon we can punctuate them with an illustration or enough of suggestion that those who are hearing the sermon go, oh yeah, I've been there, I know, and then they supply their own
But
thing.
don't go there right away.
Don't go
Don't
there
go
right
for
away.
the
Don't say today's sermon is about calm in the storm.
right.
Don't do that. You want to take them, in a sense, into the storm, so that the calm that comes emerges out of that development. And you don't even want to use the word calm, or sometimes I used silence as a translation. Others say peace, be still, but don't suggest that. And we're going to come to later about when you might tell the story. But before we finish with the arc, I want to ask this as a question. What do you think the primary focus of this story is? It might not be singular. Sometimes some of the tellers I know use the term MIT, most important thing. Well, what do you think is the most important thing or things of that story arc? Where is this story going? You can respond to that.
Good stories are who's changed by it. So I think the piece for me about the story, what the story's trying to get at is, who the hell is this guy?
Yeah, and why do they raise that question? Because of what happened.
Because of the way that the world around, the physical world around him is affected by it.
Yeah, so the trajectory of that story is to get to the point where you would raise the question, oh, maybe there is something that generates calm in storms. Yes. Any other suggestions about the trajectory? Where's that story going?
Like where we are right now in the story, which is, I think, the disciples terrified and saying, help us, and who is this guy? Are you asking what comes next after
No, I'm
the,
asking you kind of the point of the story, the orientation of that story. It's not going to say, hey, let's do some more fear.
oh,
But what's
The relationship between the disciples and Jesus.
certainly that's a part of that. And that's why I chose, say, to use the word faithfulness in that translation of that word, because it is a relationship of trust. And so that's where they come out at the end. Maybe we ought to trust this guy. Maybe we ought to trust the word of God. Maybe we ought to trust our relationships with the community. So there is that. So that's a important trajectory of that story.
I think it's also that showing that Jesus is master. He showed them that he was master over disease. He'd healed that day, and then they go across and they get into the storm, and then they're saying, well, who is this guy that even the storms obey him?
Yeah, what we saw him, what he does to people. Oh my gosh, is there a relationship to what we would say in our language, natural world, or to the cosmos, to the creation too? So we are now beginning to say, oh, Jesus is more than just a healer. He's more than just an articulate commentator on the Hebrew text. He's more than. So you're exactly right. There's there's a mastery here of something more than what we've seen on that side. So now we're experiencing another side as well. Yeah.
And when he goes over to the other side, you'll notice that he shows some mastery over the spiritual world there. Because in a sense, I would think in a Jewish mindset, on the other side is a place that's unclean,
Yeah,
dark
he is.
in their minds, and he goes and shows that he is Lord over that area of darkness or that
Yeah,
area
yeah.
as well.
We will see that in the
Yeah.
subsequent stories that follow from
Yeah.
that. So this is our crossing over to that new dimension of Jesus' mastery, or their understanding of his leadership. And that's why one of you raised earlier that question of well, don't you care? Because here you would trust the master, and now it appears like we can't trust him. Hang in there. It's not what Jesus can do, it's what the relationship of trust in Jesus does. Yeah, it makes that shift. Well, let's take a look now. If we were crafting a sermon now, using what we know as the trajectory, as the narrative plot, how would we start by creating ambiguity, staging the story, or entering the world of the story? What would be a helpful way to get folks ready for a crossing of some kind, knowing that on that day, evening, let's cross to the other side, leave the crowd behind. So now that's the stage, that's the setting up now, creating enough ambiguity. When have we been in unsettling situations or dangerous possibilities when we thought we had been in a place of comfort and control? What you think about what personal stories might be important, or illustrations from our larger world? I don't think that we have to go very far to point out some common experiences with all of us these days, saying, "Hey, I thought we were just crossing the lake." Right? But there's more. There's more, right? So in the sermon, you have to set that stage, get ready for a crossing. I sometimes talk about the first few moments of a sermon have got to be the, whoa, new world here. We're headed someplace different. I want that first openings of a sermon really to be invitation to step into now the world of this story.
How do
So
you do that? Give us an example of a way that you make it woo at the beginning of your sermon.
Boy, the other day I was just headed out to make a simple errand to go to the grocery store, and I witnessed an accident. And now I had to stay and deal with this complex situation. And I only had 10 minutes. I just had to run and get, because, whatever sort of a thing is that made us go, wait, stop, think about it. What interrupted what you thought was a normal pattern? So I might use a personal story. Or it may be, oh, I was listening to the news the other day and I just thought it was a story about that. And then whoops, something was interjected in that story, made me pause and think about that. Here recently was the mother and father on trial for the behavior of their child. And I was sort of thinking, oh yeah, well, I know this. I've dealt with parents and unruly children and so on and so on. But then I sort of like, oh, what moment in my experience of being a father or a grandfather did I miss something? And so it's that kind of like, oh, we need to pay attention. That's sort of creating ambiguity, because what we want
Part of what we're talking about is pairing a story with the story.
That's right. Yeah. And you're particularly wanting to pair personal or social experience with which the audience can
Relatable.
empathize and say, yeah, I've been there. So you are inviting them to get in the boat. And that's the way this story works. You got to get in the boat. And then something happens. The plot thickens. The storm is disruption, it's panic, it's fear of death, it's accusations against people who don't care about our situation. So you can begin then to think of, what are today's storms What are the physical, cultural, spiritual storms that we get pulled into? And that would be the next pathway of your sermon development, is to spend some time describing the storms of our life, how we all get into situations where we feel victimized, or people we trusted we can't trust anymore. We doubt our. I hinted that earlier, but here's the fishermen you would have expected were skilled, capable, dealing with these situations. So Jesus' question, in some ways, there's a subtext there, is, what happened to your skills? I was asleep in the boat because I knew you could handle anything. So there may be a degree of Jesus' own anger and frustration about, come on, guys, you've done this before. Jesus, I was tired. It was a long day. This was just going to be an easy cruise, and you guys are coming apart. What's wrong here? So, you know, so we need to spend some time in our sermon development, if we follow the pathway of this story, is describing the storms of our life. And again, you don't need to get ultimately personal, but the story has to be such that everybody can identify with storms in one's life. Does that make sense? I think you can say, oh yeah, but exactly what Linnea said was that, yes, we are taking the thrust of that story and inserting again the experiences, so we follow that same path of the story. Now, what happens after, when the calming of the storm and the question of the disciples, is what sometimes I've talked about as making the turn, when we experience now resolution of problems, some clarity, perhaps new decisions. We might even use spiritual terms of grace or forgiveness or healing or good news, that there is a resolving of the issues that comes at the end. So now we start thinking, so what makes for peace or stillness or silence or awe? What's the new relationship to Jesus that could be achieved? What does that resolution look like? Or we could ask ourselves, what helps us find calm and get to the other side? And so you're in your sermon, then you start moving toward that, but you don't want to go there until we've experienced the storm. And when folks are ready, now you can start talking about calm and resolution. So again, you can supply your own kind of illustrations or ways in which you would do that.
So I hear you talking about also not giving it away too soon. So
That's again, keep
not
reinforcing.
bypassing the hard part. And there are a couple of ways that we do it without even thinking about it. One is our sermon title. And another is the sign that goes out in front of our church. Often the paragraph that goes out in our church blog says, Jesus does this for us, and we're going to explore that. But it's done. Once you've said that to me, I don't need to come for the sermon's sake.
So what might be a title of, if you're going to use titles or use advertising, what would be a title that gives you a hint of the trajectory of the story, but doesn't give you the answer?
Open floor.
Yeah, that's open question.
Short and sweet would be storms of life.
Maybe could you turn that into a question?
Are you in the midst of a storm of
Oh,
life?
there you go. There you go. Are you expecting stormy weather?
Nice, better.
Yeah. So that's a tease. So you're not saying today we're going to talk about calming. No, you want to invite people. But if you want to back up earlier, not even get to the storm, you say, something having to do with, you think this is going to be a nice trip? You think you're going to be a next going to have a good week, you think?
Have you ever had that day?
Yes. One of those days. Sure. Now that takes you into the trajectory of that story, but doesn't give away the answer. Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, the end of the storm, then, for our sermon development, then we have to be able to describe how is the world different? You know, what does the end of the storm look like? Now, in that story, the disciples now are wrestling with the identity of Jesus, or the relationship to Jesus, or the different relationship and understanding of Jesus. So we may want to say the sermon needs to finish up quickly with a suggestion of, now the world is different, but it doesn't have to be all wrapped up. You know how television and movies do, there's sequels. So you dangle a little bit of ambiguity just at the end, not enough for people to walk away saying, oh, I'm so frustrated, it didn't come out, but you know, enough resolution, but then a little hint of, oh, work is not over yet, which it wasn't for the disciples. As we're beginning to think about our timing now, I want to have us a little conversation about, so when during the sermon do you tell the biblical story? You know, I realize in some of our liturgies, we may have that story read earlier in the worship experience. We're told earlier in the worship experience. And I often am hesitant to do that. I would often have, if scriptural text has to be used earlier in the liturgy before the sermon, then I would use a complementary scripture, one of the other texts, and not use the story there that I want to be using in the sermon. Now, I can tell it or someone else can tell it, but I want to make sure the timing. Sometimes the story is best just upfront, tell the story. But there's other times, like this story, I think begs us, maybe there's a time later in the sermon when you tell the story. You might want to take people fully into the storm and to say, you know, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a story about stormy times, and then you tell the story. And so you can use the telling of the story to take you to the resolution. Sometimes a biblical story is good to, you tell sort of half of it, interrupt with context and personal connections and so on, and then finish the story later in the sermon. But I think that's a decision, that's a strategic placement of the story that you need to work on each time to allow the story's narrative to work and not interrupt that dramatic flow of the story. Does that make sense? Yes, and what I would say is, let the biblical story be your guide as to how you want to let that story work best. Some cases you're just setting the stage for the story, and then the story carries it out. You don't have to say anything. Finish with the story. In other cases, you want to tell that story and then pull them in the complexity of that story. I've been working recently with some other narratives. I look back at some recent stories, and I'm preparing. I'll be preaching this coming Sunday on the transfiguration, and again trying to say, okay, now we're looking at experiences of awe, but deep transitions in what's going to happen next. Now we're facing difficult times. Recently, I was looking at the story of the widow's oil, and just earlier this year preached on the vineyard revolt in Matthew. And some of those stories really allow you to just work with it. You can do it. Other stories, you go, now what's the narrative line? You have to really sort of get at some of the meanings of the words to find that narrative plot line. Some of them don't just easily do that setting, ambiguity, resolution, denouement. Some of them don't work as easily as that. Have any of you recently worked with a story or preparing one that you're going to say, oh, I know the plot line. I can see how that could do that. Any of you had those recent experience, or maybe in preparing for something where you can see how the plot line really could suggest the structuring of the sermon?
I feel like most of the best sermons I've ever heard have done exactly that.
Yeah,
Certainly the most memorable ones where you follow the story instead
yeah,
of take from within it the best idea, the one that you love, that's the tastiest idea, and then plumb the idea.
yeah.
But actually take us step by step into the experience of the story.
One of our co-pastors recently had a sermon in which she started out saying, "You all know this story. You all know what we generally think about. But guess what I discovered?" And then she pointed out a little piece of that, like, oh my gosh, it turned that story sort of around backwards because of that. So you can sometimes work with a familiar passage and finding some little nugget in there that's going to do another from within retranslation of that.
I think you don't know this, Larry, that B.J. Johnston's workshop just before this one used the same text. So it's so great. No,
Whoa.
it's perfect. It's so great to have it addressed in these two different ways. And you've said some of the same things, and you've come at it in different ways too. And I
Okay.
know that the question that I had in my mind as he was telling and encouraging us to really see the story is how do you prepare people to see things differently when we all come with, oh, I know that story, and here's the picture I have in my mind of it. Is it like, what can we do in advance of people's imaginations so that we get them into ready to hear?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And sometimes as biblical tellers, you know, it's the translation, it's the interpretation the word that you use. I mean, I chose to say so that the boat was being swamped, filled with water. But because the word swamp has been in vocabulary recently, I thought, oh, that word carries much more. Um, and, I don't normally use a word like rebuke, but there was something that sort of carried that rebuke. That was a potent word for me that I said to keep. And we talked about faithfulness. And I chose to use filled with awe, and how you say filled with awe. Other words can do it. So sometimes the way that you choose in the telling of the story is going to open up some possibilities. Again and again, you hear people when you do biblical storytelling say, well, I never heard that before. But actually, they did. But it was the way in which it was told or the choice of particular terms that were used. The rabbis helping us understand Hebrew terminology in the keynotes today were just wonderful in that regard. And I find myself doing the same way with the Greek of the New Testament, going, oh, we've heard that translation, but that's not the right word. That's not the word that is really used there. And so when you put that in there, that can do the same thing. But I think it's connecting to people's experience is kind of the crucial part. You got to pull them into the story, but let the narrative arc, the plot, and the meanings, the important concepts, and making connections, again, help craft the sermon.
Larry,
Other questions?
sorry, it's Jeffy. I'm just wondering that it's our Western preoccupation with knowing what it means,
Yeah.
and our perhaps human preoccupation with knowing I've got it, that prevents us so many times from allowing the story to be alive and active or not listening to it. I know what it means, so I don't really have to pay attention to you telling the story. And actually, I don't really need to go back to the story because I know what it means.
Yeah.
So rather than saying, we do profess in Christianity the word's alive and active, but we don't really give it much of a chance because we've locked it up in the search for meaning. And once we've got the meaning, and I've got the meaning, yeah.
What I've found in working with the stories is, and the rabbi was suggesting that too, is that, there's multiple meanings. Well, I was playing with, they took him with them in the boat, And I first was going to use just as he was. And I was thinking, oh yeah, here's Jesus. He's not a fisherman. He was standing in the boat preaching, but he was not prepared to go out all night. You know, he was just going to, you know, catch the bus. But then I thought, since he was already in the boat is more accurate to that translation. And I thought, oh, well, that hooks up to, remember, he was doing all this preaching from standing in the boat. And so which meaning? Maybe both. Maybe there was a subtle meaning of they took Jesus just as he was, dead, tired. That might have been the powerful way to do that, would to shift the meaning again. So I think there's multiple meanings, there's multiple levels that we can tease out. And this story again, the disciples come off as like, who is this guy? Who is this masked man? You know, there's that, oh, you think you've got Jesus all wrapped up? You now know what Jesus means? Maybe there's something else there. So that's, Jeff, that's really good that to puncture or push or shove at what we think has been the established meanings of these things. Yeah. Teasing something else out.
I just always take in with the words, "Do you not care?" Because it takes me right back to, you know, one of the two stories that I know and could tell right on the spot, Mary and Martha, where Martha says, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself?" And in both cases, it feels like there's something they did have charge over, but they want Jesus to have charge over it. They want him to step in and take care of something that they're unwilling.
Ooh.
Well, they
And
can't take
Jesus
on
would flip that back and say, it's not a matter of what I can do for you. It's a matter of the faithful relationship that we have and you have with one another.
faithful relationship.
Ooh.
And yet, Linnea, there's that sense of, you know, they're saying, don't you care? There seems, could be an underlying, well, you could do something about this, but you don't seem to care. So why aren't you saving us from this storm? Why aren't you? Yeah, it's very evocative.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you can do that with the story and giving them, how many of you have questioned what you thought was solid belief? That's an opening for growth, is it not? You know, so you know, the story can to be evocative, and you know, the great thing would be if people would say, "Wow, would you do that sermon again?" Or is there a sequel? That would be good. Yeah, yes, Michael.
Well, I think the disciples, I don't think they really have the faith that Jesus could do anything to stop the storm. I think the situation was the storm was so bad, they needed every hand on deck. What are you doing sleeping while
Yes.
everyone else is working?
Yes, yes.
I think that as I read through that story numerous times, but the idea that I got is that they needed help getting that boat to shore.
Yes, and that, or in this case, crossing.
Yeah.
And I've read that interpretation too before, that it was a call for all hands on deck. Come on, Jesus, do your job. Don't create a miracle, just do what you need to do, you know.
Yeah, and the captain in Jonah's story, the captain comes down into the hold and says, "Why are you lying here asleep? Do something. Call on your God."
Yeah, yeah. So there's a humanizing of Jesus and a humanizing of that relationship of faithfulness that comes through those moments. And I do like those passages when Jesus gets edgy. Because, oh yeah, it's just time for Jesus to get a little edgy with me too.
You mean he's not a perennial nice guy?
That's right. That's right. That's right. Faith is not a matter of you know, it's a nice day. Oh, we're getting the call for timeout. The process that I worked through is on a handout that will be now available to you that will be posted, so you can kind of see at least the pathway that I was attempting to take in using the story to craft the flow of a sermon. Thank you, all of you.
Wow, thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
I think we all do. We all use stories in ways that we want to appeal to people's heads and their hearts at the same time, and their experience. And so whether you write sermons regularly or whether you find yourself simply sharing a story and reflection, this is such a great template for us.